What if the most underestimated Trump turned out to be the most brilliant? What if, in one night, Barron Trump shattered every label, every doubt, and every expectation? This isn't just another debate. This was the moment everything changed. Stay until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The email arrived on a quiet afternoon, buried between routine messages from university administrators and unread political newsletters. Most would have ignored it, an invitation to an event among hundreds of others. But Barron Trump wasn't most people. The Harvard Future Leaders Forum wasn't just any debate. It was the kind of stage that could make or break reputations. The brightest students, the most ruthless debaters, and an audience filled with future policymakers, CEOs, and journalists all gathered under one roof. This wasn't a discussion. It was war. Barron read the email twice, then a third time. "We would be honored to have you participate in our keynote debate on the future of leadership in America. Given your unique background, we believe your perspective would add an invaluable dimension to the discussion." Unique background, a carefully chosen phrase. They meant his last name. For most of his life, his name had been both a shield and a target. He had spent years in the background, away from the cameras, away from the constant comparisons. People had made assumptions. He was too young, too privileged, too sheltered. He had let them believe it. But this was different. Because standing across from him on that debate stage wouldn't be just anyone. It would be Jonathan Reynolds, a Harvard senior, a rising star in progressive politics, the media's favorite young intellectual, famous for his brutal debate style. He had humiliated opponents twice his age. He had gone viral for takedowns that left rival debaters stumbling over their words, grasping for dignity. And now, he had set his sights on Barron. The internet was already buzzing. Political commentators, Twitter analysts, and talk show hosts were building up the narrative. Trump's son finally steps into the arena. Can he handle the fire? Nepotism versus merit. Will Barron Trump be exposed? Harvard's fiercest debater meets his biggest challenge yet. And Jonathan? He wasn't hiding his confidence. On social media, he had already posted, "Privilege is a weak foundation. Let's see if it can hold up under real scrutiny." The likes and retweets piled up. The message was clear. This wasn't just a debate, it was a challenge. But that wasn't what intrigued Barron the most. What intrigued him was what Jonathan hadn't posted, the subtext beneath his words. Jonathan didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy. He wanted Barron to be another symbol of the past, someone who walked in with an inherited legacy and walked out a national embarrassment. And that's exactly why Barron was going to say yes, because the world had already made up its mind about him. And nothing intrigued him more than proving them all wrong. Barron accepts the challenge, but does he realize what he's walking into? His opponent isn't just anyone, it's someone who's been waiting for this moment their entire life. The crowd is with Jonathan, and Barron hasn't even spoken yet. Can he turn the tide, or will this be the moment he's completely humiliated on the world stage? The Harvard auditorium was packed, every seat filled, every aisle lined with students, reporters, and professors who had come to witness what was already being called the debate of the year. The anticipation was electric, a quiet tension settling over the room as the crowd murmured in excitement. On one side of the stage, Jonathan Reynolds stood tall, soaking in the energy like a performer before the grandest show of his life. This was his stage, the Harvard Golden Boy, the prodigy of progressive debate, the one who had eviscerated countless opponents before. And tonight was his biggest opportunity yet. Because across from him, seated in a black chair, adjusting his cuffs with deliberate ease, was Barron Trump, the youngest Trump, the enigma, the unknown variable. Barron had never participated in a high-profile debate. He had never been tested under these conditions, and now, sitting there, facing a crowd that had already picked their champion, it was clear he was the outsider. The moderator, a distinguished professor with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped up to the microphone. Tonight's debate will explore the question, what is the future of leadership in America? Each speaker will have their chance to make an opening statement, followed by open rebuttals. He turned to Jonathan first. Mr. Reynolds, the floor is yours. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, hands clasped, and smiled. It was a smile of confidence, a smile of control, a smile that said, "I've already won." "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, each word measured for maximum effect. "We are here to discuss leadership. But first, let's define what leadership should not be." A pause, strategic. Then, leadership is not inherited. The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, laughter. Jonathan didn't even flinch. Leadership is not something you are born into. It is not something you are handed. It is earned through sacrifice, through struggle, through understanding the people you serve. His voice rose slightly, commanding the room. Yet here we are, about to listen to a young man who has never had to fight for a single thing in his life tell us about leadership. The crowd cheered louder. Some students whistled, clapped, nodded in approval. Jonathan turned to Barron, his eyes gleaming. "Tell me, Barron, how does one lead a nation when they've never even led a struggle?" Silence. For the first time, Barron Trump was about to speak, but the room already belonged to Jonathan. The question was, could Barron take it back? His words are powerful, but the crowd isn't convinced. And Jonathan? He's just getting started. The next attack isn't just personal, it's designed to break Barron completely. The applause lingered. The energy of the room was still tilted, still leaning in Jonathan's favor. And then, slowly, deliberately, Barron Trump stood. He didn't adjust the microphone. He didn't clear his throat. He simply waited. And the silence stretched, a shift in the air, a tension that grew heavier by the second. Finally, when the last whisper had died down, he spoke. Leadership is not inherited. His voice was calm, measured, letting the words hang. That's what you said, Jonathan, and yet history would disagree. A murmur rippled through the audience. The Kennedys, the Roosevelts, Martin Luther King Jr.'s family, even Barack Obama's daughters, who will undoubtedly carry on his legacy. Are they not leaders simply because of where they come from? Jonathan shifted slightly. A tiny reaction, but Barron caught it. You argue that leadership should be earned, that it requires sacrifice. I agree. But what you fail to recognize is that sacrifice does not always look the same. Barron turned to the audience, his gaze steady. You assume that because I was born into privilege, I do not understand struggle. You assume that because my name is Trump, my voice does not carry weight. But let me ask you this. Another pause, holding the moment. If you walked into a room and every person had already decided who you were, if every word you spoke was dismissed before it even left your mouth, if you were judged not for what you did, but for the name you carried, would that not be its own kind of battle? The room shifted. A few students who had cheered for Jonathan were now listening. Struggle takes many forms, Jonathan. Some of us struggle to be seen, others struggle to be heard, and the hardest struggle of all, to prove that you are more than what the world expects you to be. A few heads nodded. Jonathan's smile had tightened. The control of the room was slipping, but he wasn't done yet. "That's a nice speech, Barron," he said, stepping forward. "But let's talk about what your family has actually done. Let's talk about power. Let's talk about the world your father built and how you, whether you like it or not, are standing on its foundation." He turned to the crowd. "You see, my friends, there's something very convenient about playing the underdog when you come from a billion-dollar empire." Laughter, agreement. Jonathan wasn't backing down. "You talk about struggle? Tell me, have you ever had to worry about affording tuition? Have you ever had to work 2 jobs just to stay in school? Have you ever had to fight for a voice when the entire world wasn't already listening?" The crowd roared in approval. "You say leadership isn't about where you come from, but what you do with it. So tell us, Barron, what have you done?" Jonathan stepped back, arms crossed, challenge issued. The audience waited. This was the moment. Barron Trump was on the edge of total humiliation. Would he break? Would he falter? Or would he prove once and for all that he was more than just a name? The audience is shifting. Jonathan feels it. And when a debater starts to lose control, that's when the real battle begins. The weight of Jonathan's challenge hung in the air. Barron stood, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on his opponent. For a moment, the entire auditorium felt frozen in anticipation. Then he spoke. "What have I done?" Barron repeated, voice even, unshaken. "What have I built? What have I struggled for? What have I earned?" He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the legitimacy of the question. "It's a fair challenge, Jonathan, and I could list the organizations I've worked with, the initiatives I've supported, the policies I've studied. But let's be honest, none of that matters to you, does it?" A murmur rippled through the audience. "Because no matter what I say, no matter what I've done to you, I will always be nothing more than my last name." A pause, a sharp pause. "So let's be clear about what's really happening here." His gaze moved across the audience as if addressing each person individually. "This isn't about leadership, it's about perception. It's about the belief that some people, by default, are unworthy of being heard. It's about the idea that identity, where you were born, what family you come from, should dictate whether your voice matters." Another ripple of murmurs. Jonathan's expression remained composed. But there was a flicker of something else now, something uncertain. Barron continued. "You accuse me of having an advantage, of standing on the foundation of a world my father built. But here's the thing, Jonathan, you're standing on a foundation too." Silence. Barron turned slightly, stepping toward the center of the stage. "You've built your reputation on being the underdog, on challenging the system, on calling out the privileged. It's made you popular, it's made you admired, and now you've walked onto this stage with the easiest opponent you could ever ask for, a Trump." Jonathan blinked. The audience shifted. "You don't have to prove anything to them," Barron continued, motioning to the crowd. "They were already with you before you spoke a single word. You could have said anything tonight, and they would have clapped. You could have insulted me for 30 minutes straight, and they would have cheered. And you know it." Jonathan clenched his jaw. The energy in the room was different now. "But now," Barron said, voice lower, stronger, "now you have a problem. A beat. Because I didn't fall apart." A sharp exhale from somewhere in the audience. "I didn't stutter. I didn't break. And now, people are actually listening." Barron turned fully toward Jonathan now. "So tell me, Jonathan, if your entire argument is built on making sure I don't have a voice, what happens now that I do?" Silence. Total. Silence. The shift was undeniable. The crowd had changed. Jonathan knew it, and he hated it. Jonathan is out of moves. The audience isn't cheering anymore, but here's the twist. What happens next, even Barron didn't expect. Jonathan forced a smile. It was subtle, but Barron noticed. The tension, the way his fingers curled slightly around the podium, the way his shoulders had stiffened, the first crack in the confidence he had walked in with. "You're good," Jonathan said, voice steady but lacking its earlier ease. "You're really good. But there's one thing you don't get." He turned back to the audience, as if regaining his footing. "Privilege isn't just about wealth, Barron. It's about influence. It's about control. And right now, you're using the same tactics that have kept power in the hands of people like you for generations." A slight pause. He let the words sit. "You're framing yourself as the victim," Jonathan continued, his voice rising. "But let's talk about what real victims look like. The single mother who works 2 jobs and still can't pay her rent. The student drowning in debt because they weren't born into wealth. The immigrant fighting to stay in a country that calls them an outsider." The audience responded, murmurs of approval growing louder. Jonathan felt it, the control returning. "You say I walked into this debate with an advantage," he continued, "but let's be honest. If you weren't a Trump, you wouldn't even be on this stage." And there it was, the final, brutal strike. The crowd erupted again, the cheers rolling over the stage like a wave. Jonathan smiled now, confidence back in full force. He had thrown his hardest punch. Barron had no way out of this one, or so he thought. Because Barron Trump smiled too. He took a breath, exhaled slowly. Then, "You're right, Jonathan." Jonathan's smile faltered. "If I wasn't a Trump, I wouldn't be on this stage." Murmurs of confusion. The audience wasn't sure what was happening. "But you know what's funny?" Barron continued. "If I wasn't a Trump, you wouldn't be here either." A pause. Jonathan's eyes flickered. "Because if my last name wasn't Trump, you wouldn't care about this debate." The murmurs turned into whispers. "If I wasn't a Trump, you wouldn't be trending right now." Jonathan froze. "And if I wasn't a Trump, you wouldn't have built your entire argument around me before I even opened my mouth." Jonathan's throat bobbed. He had no response, because Barron had just flipped the entire debate. The applause didn't come immediately. The audience was processing it, the weight of his words settling into their minds. "You say I wouldn't be here if I wasn't a Trump," Barron finished, his voice calm, absolute. "But maybe the real question is, would you?" And just like that, the room was his. Jonathan looked at the crowd. The cheers weren't coming this time, and in that moment, he knew he had lost. Jonathan is visibly shaken. For the first time in his career, he has no comeback. But what happens next? No one saw coming. Jonathan stood motionless. His mind raced, grasping for a counter-argument, a lifeline, anything to salvage the debate that was slipping through his fingers. But nothing came. The audience wasn't cheering anymore. They were waiting for him to respond, waiting for him to fight back, waiting for him to prove he was still in control. But the control was gone, and he knew it. Barron had flipped everything on him. His confidence, his tactics, his entire debate strategy had been turned into a mirror, reflecting back his own contradictions. And now, he was standing in silence. The moderator, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reynolds, do you wish to respond?" Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it. His breathing was shallow. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. His voice finally came, quieter, hesitant. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a quiet chuckle. Not out of confidence, not out of arrogance, but out of realization. He slowly shook his head. Then, in front of everyone, he turned toward Barron. "I underestimated you." A collective gasp swept through the room. The same Jonathan Reynolds who had eviscerated opponents before, who had built his reputation on humiliating those who stood against him, was now looking at Barron Trump with something no one had expected: respect. "I came into this debate expecting you to crumble," Jonathan admitted. "I thought I'd walk in here, say a few clever lines, throw in some well-timed sarcasm, and you'd fall apart." The audience was silent, hanging on to his every word. "But you didn't." He took a slow breath, his expression shifting. "Because you're not just a name, are you?" Barron said nothing. Jonathan turned back to the crowd, hands gripping the podium. "I've spent years arguing that privilege should not define leadership. That power should be earned, not inherited. And I still believe that." His gaze locked on Barron again. "But maybe," he continued, "I've been looking at this the wrong way." Another murmur rippled through the audience. Maybe privilege isn't just about money. Maybe it's also about the privilege of being heard. The shift was undeniable now. And maybe, just maybe, people like me, who have always been listened to, who have always been validated by the right crowd, have our own kind of privilege. Jonathan let out a slow, shaky breath. "And if that's true, then I owe you an apology." A stunned silence. No one could believe what they were hearing. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a moment, one that no one in the room would ever forget. The debate is over. But the impact, just beginning. The world is watching, and one question remains. What's next for Barron Trump? They doubted him. They mocked him. But in one night, Barron Trump didn't just win a debate. He changed the conversation. And the real question now? Is this just the beginning? The debate was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The internet exploded within minutes. "Barron Trump destroys Harvard's top debater in shocking twist. Jonathan Reynolds admits he was wrong. Never thought I'd see the day. #Trump-as-Reynolds trends, #one worldwide." Clips of the debate went viral. Political analysts scrambled to give their takes. Talk show hosts played the footage over and over again. The narrative? Barron Trump was no longer just a name. For years, people had wondered who he was, what he thought, what he stood for. And in one single night, he had answered them all. As the audience began to file out, reporters swarmed the stage. "Barron, do you plan to enter politics? What did you think of Jonathan's apology? Did you expect this outcome?" Barron simply smiled, adjusting his cuffs. "My goal is not power," he finally said, voice steady, "but purpose." And with that, he walked away. But one person stayed behind, Jonathan Reynolds. He watched Barron go, arms crossed, a complicated expression on his face. Regret? Respect? A mix of both? Finally, after a long pause, he nodded to himself. Maybe I should have asked him for a rematch. The camera zoomed out, leaving the world wondering, was this just the beginning of something much, much bigger? They doubted him. They mocked him. But in one night, Barron Trump didn't just win a debate. He changed the conversation. And the real question now, is this just the beginning?